point. Turning now to the New Testament documents, we see that there is an expectation of another prophet, that prophet who was to be like Moses that we heard about at the beginning of my speech from the book of Deuteronomy. But now we're reading the New Testament. In the Gospel according to John, in chapter 1, verse 19, the Jews asked John the Baptist who he was, and they offered three possibilities. They suggested, are you the Christ? Are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? Not just simply a prophet, but are you the prophet? Now he denied that he was any of these. And we know who the Christ was, but who was the prophet? Raymond Brown, in his 2-volume commentary on the Gospel according to John, tells us that it was the prophet like Moses who we already heard about in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 to 18. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Dr. Raymond Brown. He is one of the most, he was the foremost, in fact, New Testament scholar in our present time. He passed away a few years ago, and he has left his mark on New Testament scholarship. His 2-volume commentary on the Gospel according to John is the most massive I've encountered, and most detailed. In fact, a couple of years ago, when I debated my friend Joseph Smith in Leicester, he recommended that I read Raymond Brown, and I took that recommendation seriously. Now, this expected prophet would be a temporal ruler, we can tell, and therefore he was not Jesus, because Jesus was not a temporal ruler. According to John chapter 6, verse 14 in the NIV, after the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. In verse number 15, the very next verse, it says that Jesus, knowing that what they intended, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again into the hills by himself. Now, why would they intend to make Jesus king after recognizing him as the prophet? Obviously because they expected that he is to be the prophet like Moses who would be a king. And Jesus was not to be that king, therefore he was not to be the prophet like Moses. Raymond Brown writes, the Qumran Essenes seem to have expected three eschatological figures, a prophet, a priestly Messiah, and a royal Messiah. This is on page 46 of his 2-volume commentary, volume 1 rather. And further, we find in 1 Maccabees, chapter 4, verses 41 to 50, and other references, the expectation of the coming of a prophet who could solve legal problems on the pattern of Moses. At Qumran, the Essenes are told to cling to the Torah and the ancient laws of the community until a prophet comes, presumably the prophet like Moses. This is on his page 49. Now, this expected prophet would not come from Galilee, we learn also in the Gospel according to John. And since Jesus came from Galilee, Jesus is not that expected prophet. John chapter 7, verses 40 to 41 reads that some of the crowd who heard these words began to say, this is undoubtedly the prophet. They're thinking of Jesus. Others were claiming this is the Messiah, so opinion is divided. And an argument ensues. Is he the prophet? Is he the Messiah? Could he fulfill the qualifications of each? The objection was raised that the Messiah had to be born in Bethlehem. And everyone knew that he was from Galilee. So how could that be? Now a Christian would obviously answer by saying, look at Matthew and Luke's Gospels. Jesus was born at Bethlehem, so he fulfills the requirement to be the Messiah. But what about being that prophet? John chapter 7 verse 52 says, look it up and you won't find the prophet arising in Galilee. The essential point here then is that the prophet will not come from Galilee. And since Jesus does come from Galilee, he obviously does not qualify. So in the case of the Messiah, the essential point was that regardless where his hometown is, he should be born in Bethlehem. The essential point about the prophet is that regardless where he's born, he must not be from Galilee. And so I put before you, ladies and gentlemen, that Jesus did not fulfill that prophecy. Now, Acts of the Apostles in chapter 3, verses 22 and forward, has Peter saying that Jesus must remain in heaven until that time of restoration occurs, when God will give you that prophet that he promised. Now, does he mean that Jesus in his second coming will fulfill the requirements of being the prophet like Moses? That's a possibility. But even if that is a possibility, it means then that Jesus in his first coming did not fulfill the requirement of being the prophet like Moses. What seems more obvious from the reading of Acts chapter 3 from Peter's words? Jesus must remain in heaven until that time of restoration comes, when God actually sends that prophet like Moses, and then eventually Jesus will make his second coming. So altogether, I conclude from my fourth point that Jesus was not the fulfillment of that prophet like Moses, and even if he was seen as a partial fulfillment for the time, it must be held now that Muhammad more so fulfills that prediction than Jesus did. Now, my fifth and last point